October 8, 1980. A record hits shelves with one of the first computer-designed album covers ever created. Four faces obscured by red blocks, identity erased, individuality obliterated. Inside is 8 songs that sound like nothing else in rock and roll. African polyrhythms collide with American funk. Stream of consciousness preaching meets robotic precision. Loops and samples, techniques that won't become commonplace for another decade, form the foundation of every track. The album peaks at number 19 on the Billboard 200. Critics call it revolutionary. MTV, launching 9 months later, plays its lead single in heavy rotation, making stars out of 4 art school weirdos from Rhode Island. In 2017, the Library of Congress will deem it culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant and preserve it for eternity in the National Recording Registry. But here's what the accolades don't tell you. This album nearly destroyed the band that made it. The creative process sparked feuds over songwriting credits that would never fully heal. The producer stormed out of meetings. The rhythm section felt pushed aside. The frontman disappeared for weeks, unable to write a single lyric. And when it was all over, the 4 core members would barely speak to each other for years. This is the story of Talking Heads, Remain in Light, the album that proved 4 individuals could create something greater than themselves, even as it pulled them apart forever. Welcome to the Sound Vault. Every album has a story, and some stories reveal uncomfortable truths about the cost of genius. To understand Remain in Light, you need to understand that Talking Heads were never supposed to exist. New York City. CBGB on the Bowery, where punk rock is being born in clouds of cigarette smoke and cheap beer. The Ramones wear leather jackets and play 3-chord buzzsaw rock. Patti Smith channels French poetry through Marshall amplifiers. Television turns guitar solos into architecture. And then there's this trio. A nervous frontman named David Byrne, with a voice like a strangled robot, playing rhythm guitar. Chris Frantz on drums, keeping time with military precision. Tina Weymouth on bass. Except Weymouth had only been playing for a year. Taught the instrument by Byrne himself in a single 30-minute lesson. They met at the Rhode Island School of Design. Art students, not musicians. Byrne and Frantz formed a band called the Artistics. When they moved to New York and needed a bass player, Frantz suggested his girlfriend Tina. Byrne made her audition. 3 times. David gave me a lesson in 12-bar blues and the basic I-V chord progressions, Weymouth later recalled. That half hour was the only lesson I had. Everything else came from observing and listening. By 1977, they'd added keyboardist Jerry Harrison from Jonathan Richman's band The Modern Lovers, signed to Sire Records, and released their debut, Talking Heads 77. The single Psycho Killer became a surprise hit, though Byrne insisted he'd written it years before the Son of Sam murders terrorizing New York. But here's the thing about Talking Heads. They were never comfortable with success. They were intellectuals who happened to play rock music, not rock stars who happened to be smart. Every album was an experiment, every tour a new challenge. Their second album, More Songs About Buildings and Food, brought in producer Brian Eno, the British art rock wizard who'd helped David Bowie reinvent himself in Berlin. Eno saw something in Talking Heads that others missed. They weren't trying to be the next punk band. They were trying to deconstruct what a band could be. Fear of Music, released in August 1979, pushed even further. The opening track, I Zimbra, featured nonsense Dadaist lyrics sung over polyrhythmic drums that sounded nothing like American rock. It borrowed from Afrobeat, the hypnotic, groove-heavy music of Nigerian legend Fela Kuti. And when Fear of Music became their most successful album yet, reaching number 21 on the Billboard 200, the band members all thought the same thing. We can go deeper, but there was a problem, a big one. David Byrne was getting all the credit. January 1980. The Fear of Music tour is over. The four members of Talking Heads return to New York City and immediately scatter. Byrne disappears into the studio with Brian Eno to work on My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, an experimental album using sampled voices from radio broadcasts, preachers, disc jockeys, exorcists, layered over instrumental beds. It's unlike anything being done in popular music. Jerry Harrison produces an album for soul singer Nona Hendryx at Sigma Sound Studios, and Chris Frantz and Tina Weymouth, the married couple who formed the rhythm section, take a long vacation in the Caribbean. But it's not a vacation. It's an emergency meeting about their marriage and the future of the band. Tina suggested that Byrne's level of control was excessive. Biographers would later write, Weymouth wanted out. Frantz talked her into staying. They traveled through Haiti, attending voodoo ceremonies, learning native percussion instruments, jamming with legendary reggae producers Sly and Robbie. They bought an apartment above Compass Point Studios in Nassau, Bahamas. And somewhere in those Caribbean nights, a plan formed. What if they just jammed? Talking Heads had always worked the same way. Byrne would write songs. The band would learn them. Eno would produce them. Byrne's name would go first on everything. But what if they went into the studio with nothing? No songs, no structure, just four musicians, five counting Eno, creating in real time. It was radical. It was terrifying. It was the only way to prove that Talking Heads was more than just David Byrne and his backing band. July 1980. Compass Point Studios, Nassau. The four members and Eno gather in Studio B. AC/DC is recording Back in Black in Studio A, the universe's idea of a joke about commercial success. The inspiration, Fela Kuti's 1973 album, Aphrodisiac. 15 to 20-minute songs built on interlocking rhythms, bass, guitar, keyboards, percussion, all playing simple repetitive parts that meshed into complex polyrhythmic grooves. We were listening to African pop music, like Fela Kuti and King Sunny Ade, Byrne later explained to the Library of Congress. But we didn't set out to imitate those. We deconstructed everything, and then as the music evolved, we began to realize we were in effect reinventing the wheel. The method was pure Eno, record-long instrumental jams, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20. Then cut away everything except the best 2 or 3 minutes, loop them, layer them, let each musician add their part independently, without hearing what the others had done. According to Jerry Harrison, I would play a part for 4 or 5 minutes, and then the next person would go out and do something. The record was basically composed by using mute buttons on the console. It was the opposite of how rock bands made albums. It was closer to how hip-hop producers were starting to work in the Bronx, building tracks from loops, samples, found sounds. The jams were electric. Weymouth's bass lines moved like living organisms, never playing the predictable pattern, always inventing. Frantz's drums abandoned rock fills entirely, becoming pure rhythm, no showiness, just groove. Harrison layered guitars and keyboards that added color without dominating. And Eno faded parts in and out like a sculptor, revealing and concealing, creating negative space that made the listener lean in. When singer Robert Palmer, yes, that Robert Palmer, recording his album Clues at Compass Point, heard what they were doing, he grabbed a guitar and added percussion to several tracks. They brought in guitarist Adrian Belew, fresh from touring with David Bowie and Frank Zappa. Belew arrived ready to show off his signature wild, processed guitar sounds. They basically said, go into the studio and wait around till you think there should be a guitar solo. Belew recalled, all of my parts were done in one day. That day produced 2 of the most iconic guitar solos in rock history. The screaming, dive-bombing climaxes of The Great Curve that sound like machinery achieving consciousness. By the end of July, they had hours of instrumental tracks that sounded like nothing in American music. Funky but alien, danceable but intellectual, simple in construction but dizzyingly complex in execution. There was only one problem. David Byrne had no idea how to write lyrics for any of it. August 1980, Sigma Sound Studios, New York City. The instrumental tracks from the Bahamas are complete. Now comes the hard part, turning grooves into songs. Brian Eno and Jerry Harrison stay in New York, tweaking the mixes, adding synthesizer overdubs, layering in textures. They invite backing vocalist Nona Hendrix, who Harrison had just produced, to add gospel-tinged harmonies. They hire trumpeter John Hassell, who'd worked on My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, to add brass flourishes. But David Byrne? David Byrne is having a crisis. He's used to writing complete songs, verses, choruses, bridges. But these tracks don't have verses and choruses. They're just grooves, endless hypnotic grooves. How do you write a pop song over 20 minutes of polyrhythmic loops? Byrne grabs a portable cassette recorder and the rough mixes. He walks around New York City, listening to the tracks on repeat, trying to hear where his voice should go. He studies early hip-hop. Curtis Blow's The Breaks, with its rapid-fire rhythmic chanting. He listens to field recordings of radio preachers, absorbing their call and response patterns, their stream of consciousness revelations. And then he starts scatting, just making sounds. Nonsense syllables over the grooves, letting his voice become another instrument. He records himself improvising for hours, then listens back until he's no longer hearing nonsense, until the random sounds start suggesting words, phrases, meanings. It's Eno's philosophy. Lyrics don't need to be the center of a song. They're just another texture. Byrne draws inspiration from everywhere. John Miller Chernoff's academic book, African Rhythms and African Sensibility. A New York Post headline, "And the heat goes on," becomes the refrain for Born Under Punches. The Watergate scandal testimony of John Dean, the Iranian hostage crisis dominating the news. The song, Once in a Lifetime, comes from Byrne mimicking television evangelists. You may find yourself living in a shotgun shack. You may find yourself in another part of the world. You may find yourself behind the wheel of a large automobile. You may ask yourself, well, how did I get here? It's about existential dislocation, the moment when you wake up and realize you're living a life you never consciously chose. Byrne insists it's meant literally. We're largely unconscious. You know, we operate half awake or on autopilot. According to Tina Weymouth, Chris Frantz created the bass line for Once in a Lifetime by yelling instructions at her during a jam, which she then translated into notes. Brian Eno thought the first bass note of each bar was too obvious and edited it out entirely. When they returned to New York, the engineer had Weymouth re-record the line. It wasn't a big fight between me and Brian, as it has sometimes been portrayed, Weymouth said. It was just a musical dispute. But that word, fight, appears more and more as the sessions continue. Here's what Chris Frantz wrote in his 2020 memoir, Remain in Love, about the New York sessions. It seemed as if Byrne and Eno thought of us as sidemen who were no longer useful to them. At one point, Brian actually said to Tina and me that we didn't need to come to the studio anymore, as long as our parts were already recorded. Frantz and Weymouth, who had co-founded the band, who had pushed for this experimental approach, who had actually funded part of the project, were being told they weren't needed. Meanwhile, Byrne and Eno spent hours in the control room, making production decisions, adding overdubs, shaping the album's sound. They're like two 14-year-old boys making an impression on each other, Weymouth said with barely concealed frustration. The tension peaked when it came time to discuss songwriting credits. Someone, accounts vary on who, had the bright idea that all 5 participants, the 4 band members plus Eno, should write down independently what they thought the songwriting splits should be for each song. You can imagine how well that went. When the pieces of paper were compared, the splits didn't match at all. Eno saw what the band members had written, and according to multiple sources, stormed out of the meeting saying, I have never been so disrespected in my entire life. For weeks, the credits remained in dispute. When the album was finally pressed, the liner notes credited most songs to David Byrne and Brian Eno, with 2 tracks adding Jerry Harrison. Chris Frantz and Tina Weymouth, who had driven the entire rhythmic foundation of the album, got their names listed under all arrangements by the musicians. We felt very burned by the credits dispute, Frantz said in 2009, still angry 3 decades later. According to Weymouth, Byrne told graphic designer Tibor Kalman to doctor the credits on Eno's advice. Later editions of the album would be revised to credit all band members, but the damage was done. The final insult? While Frantz and Weymouth worked with MIT's Architecture Machine Group to create the album's groundbreaking computer-designed cover art, spending weeks at MIT using mainframe computers that filled entire rooms to create the iconic red blocked faces, Kalman and Eno got significant design credit. The working title for the album had been Melody Attack after a Japanese game show. But as the band listened to the finished product, they realized the title was too flippant. This music wasn't an attack. It was something stranger, more unsettling. Remain in Light, they called it instead. Byrne later said, "Besides not being all that melodic, the music had something to say that at the time seemed new, transcendent, and maybe even revolutionary, at least for funk rock songs." October 8, 1980. Remain in Light hits record stores. 2 days later, October 10th, radio station WDFM premieres the entire album start to finish. According to writer David Shepard, it was received as a great cultural event as much as a vivid art pop record. The press release is unlike any other rock albums. Instead of the usual promotional hype, Byrne and Eno submit a bibliography, a list of academic books they'd consulted while making the album. John Miller Chernoff's African Rhythms and African Sensibility works on Fela Kuti, ethnomusicology texts. It's pretentious as hell, it's also unprecedented. Critics immediately recognize they're hearing something revolutionary. The album climbs to number 19 on the Billboard 200, the band's highest chart position yet. In the UK, it reaches number 21. Sounds magazine names it the best album of 1980. Melody Maker does the same. The New York Times includes it in their top 10 of the year. But there's a problem. How do you perform this music live? The album uses at least a dozen musicians across its various tracks. Adrian Belew, Nona Hendrix, John Hassell, Robert Palmer, multiple percussionists, Eno himself on keyboards and backing vocals. Eno advises Talking Heads that the music is too dense for a quartet. They'll need to expand. So they do, dramatically. Jerry Harrison recruits an extraordinary lineup. Adrian Belew returns on guitar. Bernie Worrell, keyboard wizard from Parliament Funkadelic, brings his funk credentials. Bassist Busta Cherry Jones adds a second bass. Percussionist Stephen Scales layers in African rhythms. Backing vocalist Olette MacDonald adds gospel power. It's a 9-piece band. Talking Heads has become a funk orchestra. August 23, 1980. Before the album even drops, the expanded lineup plays their first show at the Heatwave Festival in Ontario, Canada. 70,000 people watched this new incarnation of Talking Heads tear through the Remain in Light material. 4 days later, August 27th, they perform at Central Park's Woolman Rink for 8,000 people inside the venue and another 10,000 on the grass outside the walls. The reviews are ecstatic. Robert Hilburn of the Los Angeles Times calls it a rock-funk sound with dramatic near-show-stopping force. In early 1981, Once in a Lifetime is released as the lead single. It stalls at Zuba 103 on the Billboard Hot 100. The song is too weird for commercial radio, too intellectual, too strange. David Byrne's talk singing about existential dread and beautiful houses isn't exactly top 40 material. But then something happens. August 1st, 1981. MTV launches, and they need content, desperately. The once-in-a-lifetime music video is directed by Tony Basil. Yes, the same Tony Basil who will have a hit with Mickey the following year. And David Byrne himself. Byrne wears a suit, bow tie, and oversized glasses, looking like a nerdy 1950s professor transported into the future. Behind him, inserted via primitive blue screen technology, footage of religious rituals plays, African trance ceremonies, Japanese sects, Christian evangelical services, and Byrne dances. Except it's not dancing. It's something else. He jerks like a malfunctioning robot. He slaps himself. He throws his arms in spastic gestures. He gets on the floor and swivels his head toward the camera while singing. Basil had shown Byrne hours of documentary footage. People in trances, different trances in church, and different trances with snakes, she later explained. Byrne absorbed the movements, then locked himself in a room with a camera and just became them. David kind of choreographed himself, Basil said. I set up the camera, put him in front of it, and asked him to absorb those ideas. Then I left the room so he could be alone with himself. The result is one of the most iconic music videos ever made. MTV plays it in heavy rotation. Constantly. On a network desperate for content, once in a lifetime becomes inescapable. Suddenly, millions of American teenagers are watching this weird, brilliant art school band perform what looks like a nervous breakdown set to African polyrhythms. The song doesn't hit the Hot 100, but it hits something more important: the cultural consciousness. In 1982, the video is exhibited at the New York Museum of Modern Art as part of a show called Performance Video. It's one of the first times MTV-era music videos are treated as legitimate art. The album Remain in Light becomes something rare, a commercial success that's also a critical darling, a crossover hit that loses none of its experimental edge. It influences everyone. Stop and think about the artists who cite this album as transformative. Radiohead's Johnny Greenwood. I had assumed it was composed of loops, but I learned from Harrison that Talking Heads had instead recorded themselves playing the parts repetitively. And that's why it's not exhausting to listen to. You're not hearing the same piece of music over and over again. You're hearing it slightly different every time. There's a lesson there. That lesson directly shaped Radiohead's Kid A, LCD Soundsystem, the 1975, Vampire Weekend, Foals, Nelly Furtado, MGMT, Arcade Fire, St. Vincent. The list goes on. Remain in Light proves that you can make dance music intellectually rigorous, that you can borrow from African music without simply imitating it, that loops and samples, techniques from hip-hop and electronic music, can work in a rock context. The album sells 500,000 copies in the United States alone, eventually earning gold certification. Over 1 million copies worldwide. In 1989, Rolling Stone ranks it the fourth best album of the 1980s. In 2003, it appears at 126 on their 500 greatest albums of all time list. In the 2020 update, it climbs to number 39. In 2017, 37 years after its release, the Library of Congress inducts Remain in Light into the National Recording Registry, declaring it culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. The official citation reads, Remain in Light presents the Talking Heads at their most essential, contradictory. Layers of driving dance rhythms balance vague postmodern lyrics about the body and mind. Accessible pop music structures make room for experimental instrumental breaks and electronic noise. It's immortalized, but immortality comes at a cost. December 1980. The expanded 9-piece Talking Heads tour is a critical triumph. But it's also a financial disaster. Paying 9 musicians, their crew, tour managers, and all the associated costs of a major tour means that despite sold-out shows and rave reviews, Chris Frantz and Tina Weymouth actually lose money. Their accountant delivers the bad news. They're broke. Meanwhile, David Byrne is focused on his solo projects. He's deep into editing My Life in the Bush of Ghosts with Eno. He's planning a soundtrack for choreographer Twyla Tharp's dance production, The Catherine Wheel. Jerry Harrison is working on his solo debut. Nobody's talking about the next Talking Heads album. So in early 1981, France and Weymouth returned to Nassau, to that apartment they'd bought above Compass Point Studios. They start jamming with local musicians. No pressure, no David Byrne, just fun. They formed Tom Tom Club, named after the dance hall in the Bahamas where they rehearsed. The result? Genius of Love. A laid-back, funky, ridiculously catchy single that name-drops James Brown, Smokey Robinson, Bootsy Collins, and Sly and Robbie. A song where Weymouth sings, "Who needs to think when your feet just go?" It's the opposite of Talking Heads' cerebral intensity. It's pure joy. Genius of Love hits #1 on the Billboard Disco chart. It reaches number 31 on the Hot 100, higher than Once in a Lifetime ever got. The Tom Tom Club album goes gold. Suddenly, the rhythm section has their own hit, their own identity, their own leverage. The success of the single convinced David Byrne to soldier on with Talking Heads, France later said. But the fractures remain. In 1983, Talking Heads release Speaking in Tongues, their most commercially successful album, featuring the hit Burning Down the House. They tour behind the album, and director Jonathan Demme films the shows for Stop Making Sense, which becomes one of the greatest concert films ever made. But after that tour, Talking Heads essentially ceased to function as a band. Byrne makes solo albums. France and Weymouth continue Tom Tom Club. Harrison produces other artists. In 1988, they regroup for Naked, their final studio album. But the sessions are tense. Everyone knows it's over. In 1991, Talking Heads officially disband. No farewell tour, no final statement, just silence. For years afterward, the animosity festers. Weymouth gives interviews describing Byrne as a man incapable of returning friendship. Byrne focuses on his solo career, becoming increasingly famous for projects like American Utopia and his work in film and theater. In 2002, Talking Heads are inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The four members reunite to perform exactly 3 songs. It's awkward, professional, and cold. Afterward, they scatter again. They haven't performed together since. The question that haunts Remain in Light is this: were the tensions always there, or did the creative process create them? Did the album's experimental method, everyone contributing independently, no one sure what the others were doing, foster distrust? Did Eno's favoritism toward Byrne create an unbridgeable rift? Did the credit dispute poison relationships that could have survived? Or was it simpler than that? 4 brilliant, stubborn individuals who made one perfect album precisely because they pushed each other to the breaking point. In 2022, Jerry Harrison and Adrian Belew announced a North American tour called Remain in Light. Not a Talking Heads reunion, David Byrne wasn't involved, but a celebration of the album performed by the guitarist and keyboardist who'd helped create it 42 years earlier. They recruited the funk band Turquoise to fill out the sound, creating an 11-piece ensemble that could do justice to the album's dense polyrhythms. "We would have dinner every once in a while," Harrison said, "and inevitably we would get back to talking about the tour we did in 1980 and specifically that Rome concert, and just the pure joy of it." The tour was a sold-out success. Gen Z kids who weren't born when the album was released danced to Cross-Eyed and Painless and The Great Curve, alongside aging punks who'd bought the vinyl in 1980. Because here's the thing about Remain in Light. It still sounds like the future. Play it for someone today, and if they don't know when it was made, they'll guess 2010, not 1980. The production techniques, the rhythmic complexity, the genre-blending approach, all of it feels contemporary. The album proved that rock music could absorb influences from anywhere: African highlife, funk, hip-hop, electronic music, academic literature, religious ceremonies, and create something entirely new. It demonstrated that albums could be made through unconventional processes: jamming without songs, building tracks from loops, having musicians record parts without hearing each other's contributions. It showed that music videos could be art, not just promotional tools. And perhaps most importantly, it revealed the truth that all great art is collaborative, especially when, the collaborators can barely stand to be in the same room afterward. Chris France, in his memoir published 40 years after the album's release, wrote, "You're not hearing the same piece of music over and over again. You're hearing it slightly different every time." He was talking about the production technique. The fact that the musicians played the parts repetitively by hand, rather than using loops, so there's subtle human variation in every bar. But he could have been talking about the band itself. 4 people playing their parts, never quite syncing up perfectly. The tension between them creating friction that generated heat, light, and something approaching musical transcendence. The story of Remain in Light is the story of every great collaboration. Brilliant people achieving something impossible precisely because they're willing to destroy their relationships to get there. We romanticize artistic partnerships. We want to believe genius is born from harmony, mutual respect, and shared vision. But often, genius is born from conflict. From 4 people pushing in different directions until the tension creates something none of them could have made alone. From a rhythm section that felt undervalued, proving their worth by creating one of the most influential grooves in rock history. From a producer who demanded everything and walked away angry, yet left behind production techniques that would influence decades of music. From a frontman so paralyzed by the challenge that he wandered New York City streets scatting nonsense until it became poetry. Remain in Light changed music. It influenced hip-hop, electronic music, indie rock, and pop. It proved that experimentation and commercial success weren't mutually exclusive. It showed an entire generation of musicians that the rules of rock and roll were negotiable. And it cost talking heads their future. Was it worth it? Ask the 4 former band members, and you'll get 4 different answers. But ask the millions of listeners who've been moved, inspired, and transformed by these 8 songs, and the answer is clear. Some art requires sacrifice, some masterpieces demand everything, and some albums are so perfect, so complete, so impossible, that the people who made them can never work together again, because they've already achieved something that can never be repeated. This has been the Sound Vault. Every album has a story, and some stories, like Remain in Light, teach us that the greatest art often comes at the highest cost.